Hello everybody, welcome, good evening and welcome to this very special event. My name is Joy Carter, I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the entire university community. So we're here for Paul Sowden's professorial lecture. And what are inaugural lectures? Well, they're a chance for us to celebrate the achievements of our staff, our colleagues, their outstanding research and often their outstanding teaching as well. We're proud to be a university with high quality research and teaching and especially proud to be driven by our values. And one of the themes that runs through all our values is creativity. This evening's talk is about creativity. It's about how we're rooted in creativity, we as individuals, and how creativity impacts on all life and the planet. So this evening's lecture covers this fascinating theme, looking at how we as humans respond to new ideas, novelty, and creativity. And as I said, these are areas we're really passionate about here at Winchester. I like to think they're in our DNA. So when I met Paul recently, he told me a fascinating story about how his own life trajectory took a very different direction in response to creativity and novelty. So I'm going to tell you the story. So this goes back some years to when he was deciding where to do his undergraduate degree. And like most A-level students, Paul visited a university open day. Now, Paul is, of course, a psychologist, but at the time it might surprise you to learn that he was expecting to study law. So he was on a campus, expecting to study law, heading to a mock trial that was being put on by the university to attract new students. What happened? Well, on his way to the mock trial, Paul walked past the psychology department and was completely blown away by what he saw. The creativity, the novelty and the inspiration of what was going on there captivated him so much. And he never made it to the mock trial. It was so exciting in the psychology department that he spent the rest of the open day with the psychology team and the rest of his career as well. So Paul went on to do his undergraduate degree in psychology at the University of Surrey, and he was there for nearly 30 years. He completed his PhD there in psychology and learning, and he had a variety of roles there as researcher, head of department, and subsequently as head of school. And we are, of course, delighted to have prized Paul away from the university and bring him here to Winchester. He joined here last year. Paul is Professor of Psychology, Cognition and Creativity in our Department of Psychology. He's also the research lead, and that's an important role as well. Paul is a leading expert in the field of creative thinking, and that is an increasingly important area within our society and also for the economy. We often ask employers what skills they're looking for in our graduates, and they come out with things like, whoa, time management and this, that and the other. But the one that's always there, really up front, is creativity and problem solving, those sort of skills. And of course, creative industries are at the heart of the government's industrial strategy as well. Paul's research, working in collaboration with the OECD, involves looking at how schools and universities can foster critical and creative thinking skills within their teaching. That's hugely important work that he's doing. The world needs creative thinking. It's never needed it more than it needs it now. We need it to help solve the massive challenges facing all life and the planet. Paul, it's wonderful to have you with us as part of the Winchester family. We're hugely grateful for the contribution you make to this university and the impact your research is having more widely. We're very proud of Paul and his work here. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving Professor Paul Sowden a very warm welcome.
And particularly at the start, I didn't want to forget anybody important in my thank yous. So I wrote this bit down. So good evening and hello all. Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for your introduction. So before I start, I just want to take the time to thank all of you for being here to share this special occasion with me. I also wanted to say that the building of knowledge is never the work of one person. We're a social species, and one of our strengths is our capacity to collaborate and to pass knowledge on. So it is that the work I will report today owes a debt of gratitude to the many fantastic colleagues and PhD students that I've been able to work with over the years. I wish I had time to mention all of the work I've done with all of them, but there's only so much you can do in 45 minutes. If you're here or watching this from afar, and your work with me is not mentioned, I can promise you it's not forgotten. Thank you, one and all. And so, on with the lecture. So, it's often said the best things come in threes, and I hope I can pull that off with the lecture today. My lecture is divided into 3 parts. And the first part really reflects the sort of earlier stage of my career. So I started out working really on how we perceive our world and interact with it and attend to it. So it's about how we actually detect novelty via our perceptual systems and how we respond to having to perform new tasks. Then, following a sabbatical year, I moved to work on how we actually generate novelty. As Joy has said, the Vice-Chancellor has said, at the heart of the government's industrial strategy published last year is the creative economy. And yet, despite employers asking for creative thinking skills in potential new employees, it's often argued that creative thinking is being marginalised in our education system. So we have this sort of tension between the two. To me, it feels like an important question to understand how people think creatively and what we can do to help foster those creative thinking processes. And then in the final part of my talk, I want to draw the 2 parts of my career together and think about some interesting connections between how we detect and respond to novelty in the moment and how that in turn supports the generation of novelty, of new ideas, and thereby creative thinking. So detecting novelty. So before I get into stuff I've done, I just want to set the ground with a few other pieces of important work that kind of set the background. So one very important finding that's emerged over a long period of time is that our brains are not born ready to perceive our world, but in fact respond to the perceptual experiences we have during our early development and childhood. This is just an example from Project Prakash, which is a project that's being run in India to help people who've been born with cataracts have their sight restored. Now, in the UK and many countries, cataracts would be restored very, very soon after birth. But what's happening in India is that many people do not have cataract surgery nearly soon enough. And that has a very dramatic impact on their ability to perceive the world. Nevertheless, Project Prakash is working to restore people's sights through surgery later in life, but they're also tracking how the brains of individuals who are newly sighted differ when they first start perceiving compared to people who've been sighted from birth. And that's what we're looking at here. So we have 2 images, one looking underneath a normally sighted individual's brain and one looking underneath someone who's newly sighted. The coloured blobs just represent patterns of brain activity, and we can see they're quite dramatically different when someone is newly sighted. So not having typical experience during development results in a very different pattern of response in the brain. So how normally do we ensure that there is a good range of experience during development in order to get a well-functioning, optimal visual system? Well, fortunately, or perhaps by design, we come wired to respond to novelty. So anyone who's been a parent, an aunt, an uncle, a sister, a brother will know how much children like, or at least respond to new things. Not always like, but certainly are drawn to novelty. In fact, psychologists have developed whole techniques around this being wired for novelty. So I'm just going to show you a short bit of footage that was shot in the Surrey Baby Lab by colleagues many years ago. And this is something called the Novelty Preference paradigm. And the way this works is infants get bored of things after they've been looking at them for a while. So in this particular case, this infant's been presented with a patch of colour. They've stared at it, they've got bored of it, and then they're presented after a short pause with two stimuli. One is the patch of colour they saw before, and one is a different colour. And so by seeing if the infant shows a preference for the new colour, psychologists can assess whether it can discriminate between those two different patches of colour. So it's making use of that novelty preference. And just to show you how compelling this can be, so here we have the infant just getting to the board stiff with the colour patch it's been viewing stage. Head turned away, no interest whatsoever. This is the pause, and then in a moment we're going to have two colours presented side by side. Which one does the baby prefer to look at? So we can see this baby's clearly looking to the left, which is where the new patch of colour was presented. So showing a preference for novelty. So that novelty preference ensures that infants are engaging with a wide range of environmental stimuli during development, and that in turn helps to ensure that the experience-driven changes to our visual and other perceptual systems are optimized. Why else might we be drawn to novelty? Well, here's an example. So imagine you're visiting a new town, and you walk into a bar, and it's a small bar, it's a locals bar, and as you step through the door, the room goes silent, all heads turn towards you. You're a stranger in the midst of a bunch of people who are familiar with each other, and they're wondering, who is this person? Yeah? Are they someone I want to approach? Are they someone I want to avoid? Yeah? Do I want to engage with them or keep well away? So that's a sort of very social benefit of being attracted to and drawn to novelty. You may have noticed, yes, I can see you all have, that there's some bird song coming from the speakers. That again is just an example of how we cannot but notice unexpected events, new events for the context that we're currently in happening, as with the example of the bird song here. Novelty can also be very rewarding. I mean, last year I visited the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and I saw Gerhard Richter's work for the first time in the flesh, presented sort of full size in full Technicolor on the wall. And it's so different seeing the work for real. It was very sort of moving. I sort of thought this is wonderful artwork. So encountering new things can be very pleasurable and very rewarding for us too. So there's lots of reasons why we might be drawn to novelty. So an interesting question is, what happens when we have to perform a new task? How do we adapt to that if we have to perform a new task that not everybody has to do? So what happens when we start to develop expertise? There's been lots of work on this done, and this is just one example, essentially showing that when we got expert hockey players to have to judge the direction in which a shot was going to be played in a penalty stroke, the activity in the expert hockey players' so-called action observation network was selectively different when they were making judgments about hockey shots compared to badminton shots or compared to non-expert controls. Now, of course, hockey is something that you would often start playing in childhood, so this might still be an example of adapting the visual processing that's starting during childhood. But it shows the sort of specialization in response to the requirement to perform a new task that we can show. So how about a task that you would typically learn as an adult? Well, relatively early in my career, I was funded with my former PhD supervisor Ian Davies and a colleague Sean Hammond to look at expertise in mammographic screening. So how do radiologists become expert at detecting potential abnormalities that could be indicative of cancer? So if we look at the image on the left here, this is a typical image in which, in fact, there is a cancerous feature present in one. And it's shown circled there. These sort of small white dots called microcalcifications can be a sign of a disease process, so very important for someone to be able to detect. This is quite an obvious example, but very often the variations, the abnormalities are very, very subtle, and they're very challenging for the limits of visual perception. So, of course, we're interested to understand this expertise and therefore how it could be helped, and also how the technologies that we use to take the images could be designed better to match the characteristics of the human visual system. Now, a question that went along with this is, are the experts just good at this sort of task in the first place, or is this something that's arising through learning? And if they're learning something, are they just learning information about the sorts of features they have to look for, or is their perceptual system being shaped up in adulthood? So one clue comes from this image on the right. This is a calibration stimulus used for X-ray machines with which a radiologist would not have any particular expertise. It's not something they would normally look at in their screening practice. And yet they were still much better at detecting the very faint dots. So if you look at this image as you move from left to right, you can see there are some dots which you can probably see at the top that get smaller as you move to the right and get fainter as you move down. And the radiologists are better at spotting just these simple dots compared to matched controls. So this gives us a clue that their visual processing is better, but it still doesn't tell us whether that visual processing was being improved as a result of their extensive experience of looking at X-ray images. This kind of ushered in the sweatshop psychophysics era of my career. So for those of you who aren't familiar with psychophysics, psychophysics is essentially a set of methods where you try to manipulate physical characteristics of stimuli and measure the psychological response to them. Psychophysics is typically carried out in a very black lab, like the one on the left here. The one that I was ushered into had a black ceiling, black furniture, black everything, the lights were turned out, and my supervisor locked the door and threw away the key. And I didn't get to emerge for about 2 years from that place. I was given this very sort of archaic equipment to use, and I had to learn to wire it all up and plug it together. Now, working in the lab, we made use of some interesting properties of our world. And one of the interesting properties of our world, in the sense, is that it's quite a stripy world. I've obviously picked some images here which are very much stripy. We have the stripy ferns, the stripes on the zebra. And even if you look at this landscape scene here, you've got the sort of the broad horizontal band, the light band of the sky, a darker tree line, sort of a lighter band of the grass. We've got the individual branches and trunks of the trees. So there's lots of boundaries which, at a crude level, we could think of as stripes. Now, these aren't the sorts of things we present to people in the lab. We present them with these things called sinusoidal gratings. But you can see that essentially they're patterns of stripes, and we can vary the width of the stripes, roughly speaking, the spatial frequency, and the orientation of the stripes. Now, our brains have developed, arguably, to deal, in a sense, with the stripy nature of our world. And we have populations or clumps of cells that are selective for particular stripe widths and orientations in certain particular areas of our brain, in visual processing areas of our brain. So we trained people. We trained people for a period of weeks. We locked them in the lab too. And we sat them in front of a computer, and we flashed on the computer very, very faint patterns of stripes. And we looked to see whether their ability to detect those stripes could improve. And they did this 10,000 times. So a massive, massive amount of training. And what we found was, yes, they could improve. And the improvement they showed had a gradient of generalization. They got most improved at a particular stripe width, and a certain amount improved at similar stripe widths until you moved away to no improvement at all. Now, this gradient of generalization very closely mirrored the response function of populations of cells in the brain that process visual information about these stripes. So what we were able to deduce was that the change was happening in these cell populations, and that was quite a radical finding, because at the time, The belief was that this type of change in response to training experience could not happen in adults. And what it also told us was that it was conceivable that the expert radiologists, by virtue of the huge amounts of training experience that they'd had when they had to perform this new task, had similarly shown these kinds of enhancements to their visual processing as adults. Now, if you go around changing an adult's response to visual information on the fly, so you're presented with a new task, something new to perform, and you suddenly go changing the way all the visual processing is done, that might have the cost of interfering with any other tasks relying on those same processing mechanisms. So that's probably why it took so much effort, in a sense, to initiate change. Those 10,000 trials, the brain of an adult becomes less keen to recalibrate its responses. Are there other ways it could address the need to perform a new task? Well, one way is by flexibly altering attentional processing. And in another large series of experiments, we explored this possibility. So if you're sitting towards the front or the back of the room, hopefully you can see in this left-hand image here something that looks like a road receding into the distance. And superimposed over that road, you'll be able to see, if you're sitting closer, is a kind of a random noisy pattern, yeah? Like a sort of mask, yeah? There's no information there. So you've got the road in the coarse information and then just noise in the fine information. In the center image here, if you're sitting towards the front up to about halfway back, you can probably see the outline of some skyscrapers. So in that image, we've kept the fine detail associated with the skyscrapers, and then we've put in the coarse detail just random noise. And if you're sitting further towards the back, can you now see the skyscrapers emerging there as well? Okay. And then finally, the image on the right we call a hybrid image. It's the fine detail information associated with the skyscrapers superimposed on the coarse information associated with the road receding into the distance. And what we found in a very long series of experiments was essentially we could cue people to expect information in either the coarse scene or the fine scene. And they had to report whether they saw a road or whether they saw a city. So a very simple task. And when we cued people, they showed a pattern of better performance. They were better able to report the road or the city. But moreover, the pattern of generalization was again suggestive that the change was happening because they were cueing attention to specific populations of cells in the brain that processed visual information. So we were able to show that there was this flexible shifting of attention. Now, at this point, the Vice-Chancellor, having introduced this as a talk on creativity, is probably wondering where it's going, and I'm sure many others in the room are. I'm going to come back in particular to this notion of flexible attention later on, because I think it's one of the key links that we'll be exploring today. But for now, on to the question of generating novelty. So I'm just going to start by getting you all to do a classic psychological task that looks at problem solving. So this is Lutchin's Water-Jug Problems. So we've got 3 jugs here. And the 3 jugs hold different amounts of liquid. So jug A can hold 21 cups worth of liquid, jug B 127 cups, jug C 3 cups. And by filling and emptying the jugs, you have to get a particular quantity of liquid. In this case, you have to end up with 100 cups of liquid. So to solve this problem, we could fill jug B to the brim, so it's got 127 cups worth. We could empty it out into jug A, thereby getting rid of 21 cups and leaving us with 106. We could then pour another 3 cups into jug C and empty it, and then another 3 cups into jug C and empty it, and we'd be left with our desired quantity of 100 cups. So we could just think of this as B minus A minus 2C. Okay? Here's another example. So how would we solve this one? Thank you.
B minus 2C minus A.
Yes, exactly. So we flip the order around, but it's the same thing, right? So we fill jug B to capacity, pour out jug A, pour out 2 lots of jug C, emptying in between, and we end up with the desired quantity of 99 cups. This example, we can do the same thing again. Yeah? B minus A minus 2C. This example, what would we do here? I heard someone give an alternative. I'll come back to it. And what about this one? How would we solve this one? Right. So, typical behavior, but not universal behavior, as some of the voices there indicate, is that up until the 4th row here, you get to the 4th row, and most people go, oh yeah, you know, I know how to solve this now. Yeah, all you do is you do B minus A minus 2C. Yeah? And so most people persist with approaching the problem in that way, and then they get to the final row, and they try to apply the same rule, and of course, suddenly it doesn't work. And that triggers them, that process of being stuck, triggers them to find another solution, the much simpler solution of A minus C, which they could also have applied to the 20-cup problem, the 4th problem here. But a majority of people don't spot that alternative, simpler solution, because once we've got into a set way of solving a problem, we developed a problem-solving set, we tend to persist with applying our solution until something triggers us to do otherwise. Because if you think about it, if every time you did something like this, you looked for all possible solutions, yeah, that could be quite an inefficient process. And as a problem gets more and more complex, so it becomes more and more inefficient to continually search for a new solution when you've got one that's working perfectly well anyway. Here's another little problem for you. So in this problem, we have 3 bags of money on the left and 3 empty bags on the right. And simply by touching one bag, you have to create a pattern of alternating full and empty bags. How would you solve that problem? Sorry, I did hear a suggestion. How do you mean second one to the second? You can only touch one bag. Yeah. Move the second one there to that one there. Is that what you meant? Yeah. So again, often this takes people a pause to think about how to solve this. When I first saw this, I thought, well, I'll grasp a bag and kind of shove the others around and get them out of the way until they're somehow in the kind of right sequence. But if you actually just take the additional step of thinking, what I've got is I've got a container and I've got contents, yeah, then you can start to think about, okay, what I've got to do is empty the contents of the container into another bag. So this just takes a little bit of a leap of insight. Still not a particularly challenging one, but a bit of a leap of insight. And it's an example of what we would call a closed-ended problem. There's a defined goal state that we're trying to reach. Now, there are lots of games which are closed-ended problems, chess being a great example. And what we can see here in the image on the right is Garry Kasparov, the world's greatest ever chess player, head in hands, in the series of 6 games in which IBM's Deep Blue computer defeated him. The first time a computer had beaten a world chess champion like this. Now, chess is a closed-ended problem in some senses. There's a defined goal state at which the game ends. Checkmate. And at any one point in time in a game of chess, it's been estimated there are roughly 20 moves available to you. So this was pretty good. But Google's DeepMind team wanted to try something a bit more challenging. So they picked the game of Go. Now, the game of Go has at any one point in time roughly 200 moves available to be made. And they used an AI system which learned and eventually trained by playing itself to get very good at playing Go. And it then subsequently beat the world champion in a series of matches 9-0 in 2016. So we've gone an order of magnitude up from the complexity of chess. Not content with that, Google's team then said, okay, let's develop another AI system that they called Alpha Star and see if we can beat StarCraft. Now, not all of you will be familiar with StarCraft. It's a game that's been around for 20 years. It involves essentially taking charge of one of 3 alien races, building resources, building armies, harvesting resources, building buildings, building armies, harvesting resources, and trying to raise all your opponent's buildings to the ground. And when you've successfully done that, then you've won the match. Now, it's been estimated that in a game of StarCraft, at any one time step, there are 10 with 26 noughts after it possible moves that could be made. So incredibly, incredibly complex game. 2018, the computers won. So we can see that with problems where there's a defined end state, AI systems are now doing better than the best of humanity. But as we'll see, this may not be the same for open-ended problems, what a lot of people would think of as creative problems. So when psychologists think about creativity, they typically think about creativity from the perspective of the person who's being creative. So what, for instance, are their personality characteristics? The underlying thinking processes involved in being creative. The types of environments in which the creativity is taking place. So what resources do those environments afford, and how do they impact on or press on the creative problem-solving process? And then thinking about the product that comes out of this process, we tend to think about a creative product as being something that is new or original, but also effective. And that word effective is often used because it can capture everything from a creative product in art, where effectiveness might be the capacity to evoke a response in the viewer of that artwork, through to effectiveness in terms of a new engineering solution for something that's previously been solved another way. So, novel plus effective. So how are the computers doing with that kind of definition on an open-ended creative task? So we've got two works of art here. And one has been generated by a human artist, James Tatum, and one has been generated by an AI art system called AICon, developed at Rutgers University. Who thinks the human artist painted the work on the left? Let's have a show of hands. Okay. And who thinks the human artist made the work of art on the right? Let's have a show of hands. Okay, so I'd say there was a clear majority there for the work of art on the left. Absolutely right. But the computer's not done a bad job, right? It fooled possibly some of the people in the room. So creative AI computer systems are producing works that can actually fool human beings, as that their work is actually the product of another human. So in a sense, they've passed a kind of creativity Turing test. But nevertheless, in most cases, comparisons have shown that human work is still preferred, is judged to be more creative, is judged to be of higher quality. So in that sense, the human work is generally still beating the machines. And if you think a step on, this is just one particular domain of creative activity, art. But in actual fact, of course, we have evolved to be able to come up with a new way of dealing with anything, almost anything, or an infinite range of problems that our world might throw at us. So humans are still unsurpassed when it comes to flexible, open-ended creativity. Now, creativity is not just about art. I've already mentioned engineering. Here's just an example of a very simple, everyday creative task that we're currently using to explore the impact of access to digital resources, the internet, on people's creative thinking processes. This is something we've all had to do, I'm sure, in our lives, yeah? So we just ask people, or we tell people you need to think of a creative and unusual gift for someone you do not know. You want your gift to stand out as something really original, so the novelty bit, clever and creative, compared to other gifts they may receive, but it must still be appropriate to give to someone you do not know. So the appropriate is that effectiveness bit. That's a very simple kind of example of everyday creativity in which we're all engaging. So creativity is not reserved for people who are especially gifted. It's just something that's important to our everyday lives, to all of us. And it's not specific to art. It cuts across all domains. Here are some examples of creative products. So we'll probably all have our own views on which is the more creative product of this set. Some people might think it's Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared. Some people might say it's the first mass production motor car, the Ford Model T. Some might prefer the classic Mini or the reinterpretation in the new Mini. Some people might think that the child's stick figure there, where a child has discovered for the first time how they can represent a human body and its various bits in a sort of very simplified form. Yeah, that would be an example of a personally creative moment for the child who's produced the artwork, but probably not very creative for their family, yeah, and certainly not on the world stage. Whereas Einstein's equation is arguably historically creative. It's creative on the world stage. So there are different levels of creativity, and there's creativity in many different domains, from art through engineering, science, etc. But at its heart, the creative process boils down to two crucial things. And we can see that just in this very simple demonstration of some work we did to look at the effect of mood on creative thinking. So the two key things to creative thinking are a process of generating ideas and a process of analysing and evaluating those ideas in order to help them be as effective as they can be. We can see these are two separate processes. For instance, we simply manipulated people's mood by getting them to watch videos. Most people laughed at Mr. Bean, not everybody I accept, but that was our make people happy condition. We had an instructional video on how to watch the BBC iPlayer, and we had a video about the very serious topic of genocide in Rwanda, which, as you can imagine, upset people. And what we found was that people's idea generation was benefited by the happy Mr. Bean positive activating mood. And this has been shown time and time again in much research. The new bit here for us was to explore what happened to the quality of people's judgments of which were the best creative ideas when they were in negative mood states. And that was indeed enhanced. So it was like the sort of bad mood made people more discerning, made them more accurate at judging which were the higher quality creative products. In more recent work, we've been trying to start to look at how these processes interact over time. So this is just an example of some work that we've been doing. And what we're showing here essentially is the brain activity associated with performing three different tasks. One is just looking at the process of associating different pieces of information. So if you think about generating new ideas, very often to generate a new idea, you've got to put two pieces of information together in a novel way, things that haven't previously been put together. So that's an associative thinking process. When you're sort of trying to choose the most effective solution, you're engaging in an evaluative, analytic thinking process. And when you put them both together, then you're engaging in a creative thinking process. And we can just see here the different wiggly lines essentially are showing that there are dissociable patterns of activity associated with each of these processes. And that's going to help us start to look at how these processes operate over time. So we've been working on a sort of conceptual model that we think of as a balance model of the creative process. And at the heart of that model is a shifting mechanism, a mechanism that is shifting between associative and evaluative analytic thinking. Now, we think of it as a balance model rather than two ends of a continuum because it's perfectly possible to both be generating and evaluating ideas at the same time. These associative and analytic processes can be going on in tandem. So we have our seesaw, and the shifting mechanism can put more emphasis on associative thinking, on analytic thinking, on both, or on neither. Wrapped around this is our thinking about the thinking process, how much we're actually aware of the thinking process in which we're engaging. That's our metacognitive processing. And it's thought that may in turn help the creative thinking process. And certainly we've found in other work that people who do a lot of creative activity, such as architects, showed better metacognition around their creative thinking process. We also have the resources that we can draw upon. That might be information we have stored in our memory from similar tasks we've performed before. It might be information available to us in our environment. And finally, we have the affective state, wrapped around it all, modulating this balance of associative and analytic thinking. That was the conceptual model. We wanted to test how it might play out, not only in the context of very specific tasks in a brain activity recording context, but also in a real-world context. And so when we were searching around for a domain, we turned to the domain of garden design. Now, to me, this was a really interesting domain. At the time, I was studying garden design in the evenings at Merristowood College in Guildford, just for fun. And I thought, well, it's actually a very, very fascinating skill, garden design. If you're used to gardens like that on the left, you might not think there's much creativity in gardens. But if we look at the image on the right, this is an image that appeared at, this is a garden that was made at Hampton Court Palace Flower Show several years back. It's called Ecstasy in a Black Box, and it was made to represent being in a bipolar state, and it was made for a bipolar charity. So the kind of outer black box, the sort of prison-like structure, is the sort of, the prison of the person's mind, and then the inner black box spilling its contents is the sort of sense of euphoria and liberation that can often go along with a sort of high bipolar state. So garden designers, when they're designing, have to be able to project how a garden is going to evolve over time. They've got to be able to think about the changing seasons, how things grow over the years. They've got to be able to think about how the impression of that garden is not just a visual thing, but it's how it sounds as the wind rustles through different types of plants' leaves. It's how it smells. All of this is having to be integrated and simulated, and they're having to build really quite a complex mental representation of how a garden will be over time. So actually, it's quite an elaborated cognitive process designing a garden. So we took expert garden designers, we took professional fine artists who were very good drawers, like the expert professional garden designers. We took people who were trained to be garden designers, and we took people with no expertise in either, and we got them to think aloud as they designed a garden that represented going on a journey. And we recorded everything they said, we videoed everything they said, and we then categorized all of their statements as mapping on to one of four types of thinking process. First of all, we simply categorized them as either associative thinking, so they put two ideas together, or we categorized them as analytic thinking, so they'd evaluate an idea and perhaps make some comments, reflective comments on how it might be improved or changed. And also we coded for whether there was emotion words in what they said. So were they making an effectively influenced analytic comment? So was it almost like a gut feeling? I don't like the way this feels, it's claustrophobic, so there's sort of an emotional content. Or was it more just a, this isn't going to work with the scale type analytic comment? So was emotion involved in the analysis or not? And likewise, was emotion involved in the association making or not? And we modeled how people shifted between these different types of thinking states over time as they designed their gardens, and some very interesting things emerged. So first of all, the pattern of shifting between associative and analytic thinking was very predictive of the final quality of the garden designs and their creativity as judged by expert flower show judges. So specific patterns of shifting predicted more creative designs. And in particular, we found that when people made an effectively laden, so an emotional sort of evaluation of a design idea, that was followed up with a new associative idea that was non-emotional, that was very predictive of shifting to a new design, and in turn, that producing many designs was predictive of the creativity of the final outcome. So there was something that the garden designers in particular had around their kind of gut feel for the ideas that predicted their design process and predicted better designs at the end of that design process. So it might be possible to influence creative thinking by influencing the shifting between these different modes of thinking. So how might we do that? Here's one example from research we've done. This was work with children in primary school education, and we were interested in teaching different areas of the curriculum in ways that they wouldn't typically be taught. So what happened if children, instead of doing dance in a PE curriculum, learn this dance by following this set of moves way, had to learn a sort of more improvisational dance style? Or what happened if they had to engage in improvisational drama activities? And what we found was that engaging in improvisation led those children to be better at then generating new creative ideas in a variety of different domains. So it's almost as though the act of improvising then helps them shift into a more associative thinking process. So I like to think of fostering creative thinking as trying to get together a toolkit of different tools that you can use to shift thinking from one process to another, or vice versa. So now back to that attention point that I was making earlier. So one of the things we noticed in the work where we were looking at people's attention to particular spatial scales and demonstrating that this appeared to be modulation of activity of particular populations of cells in the brain was that actually there was a wide variation in people's ability to deliberately attend to one set of information or another. Now, there's been a lot of work done in creative thinking in recent years that has actually explored how is creativity and how are creative thinking processes related to people's pattern of attention. So if we look at these stimuli on the right, these are another classic psychological stimulus called Narvon letters. And if you look at each stimulus, you can see you have a large letter that's made up of smaller letters. So we talk about the large letters as being the global level and the small letters as being at the local level. So we have a large global E made up of small e's and a global H made up of small e's as well. So you can ask people to report which letter they see either at the global or the local scale. So in one task that my colleague Daria Zabalina and others performed, they simply asked people to report whether on each trial a letter S or a letter H was presented. So if we take the letter on the right here, the big letter H, okay, they'd simply have to report that an H had been presented. However, they were given a cue before each trial was presented to tell them either to look at the local letters, that's where they'd see an S and H, an S or an H, or the global letter. And most of the time the cue was right, so people paid attention to them, but every now and then it was wrong. And the question is, if you get a miscue, how quickly can you switch from the local to the global processing or vice versa? Well, people who are better divergent thinkers are much quicker to be able to switch their attention. They have greater attentional flexibility. So there's actually this linkage between generating ideas and one's capacity to switch attention. So if we think about the many ways, there have been many studies looking at ways in which we can influence creative thinking. All sorts of things can have beneficial effects, and I'm sure there are plenty of people in this room who will have many other ideas and tried and tested methods that work. So some examples, but a lot of these all relate to injecting some novelty into the creative thinking process. So for instance, exploring new topics, having a wider range of interests, being immersed in other cultures have all been shown to enhance creative thinking ability. Improvisation, we've seen, can enhance creative thinking ability. Taking a walk, getting out into one's environment and experiencing some novelty in that environment may enhance creative thinking. We're currently looking to find out. Novelty can also be found in our heads. It's not just about what's externally available. It's also about the things that you already know, about the knowledge and memories that you already have. And so it is, for instance, that mind-wandering, people are suggesting, may also help us find new associations and thereby enhance creativity. Okay, so now for the final part. Thinking about novelty as an organising principle. So in terms of detecting novelty, hopefully what we've learned is that humans come ready to respond to novelty. Our brain development depends on it to develop typically. Detecting new things remains important to us as adults. We have to judge whether a new event represents an opportunity or something to be avoided. If it's an opportunity, that opportunity may turn out to be rewarding. So there may be intrinsic value in being attracted to new things. And we've also learned that our adult brains can change in response to being required to perform a new task, but more selectively so. Because once you've got effective ways of doing things, effective ways of processing information, changing those too readily on a permanent basis might interfere with other types of processing. In terms of generating novelty, we've learned that creative thinking involves the combination of novelty with effectiveness. And humans are unsurpassed still at open-ended creativity. And moreover, at the heart of that process is a a set of flexible thinking capacities, the capacity to shift between associative and analytic thinking, the capacity to flexibly control our attention in order to allow more novelty in or out. So as I draw my lecture to a close, I hope that I've begun to show some of the interesting connections that exist between our detection of novelty and our generation of novelty. For both, there is an ongoing tension between tried and tested approaches that have served us well so far and doing things in a new way to adapt to specific circumstances, to new circumstances. In the same way that a new perceptual challenge may sometimes require adjustment of our sensory processing systems, so a new problem can require adjustment of our ideas. But adjustment can require substantial time and fine-tuning. And it can potentially disrupt other processing or ways of doing things, resulting in a loss of efficiency. Further, our ability to detect new things is dependent on our mechanisms of attention. And by facilitating the detection of novelty, those same mechanisms contribute that new information to the generation of more novelty. For humans at least, our relationship with novelty is lifelong and life-changing. Without our sensitivity to, our desire for, and our drive to generate novelty, we would be unable to respond effectively to our environments in the short or the longer term. So thus I argue novelty would seem to be a key organising principle of the human experience. And by keeping this principle at the heart of our thinking about creativity, we can begin to develop new ways of injecting novelty, for instance, through the modulation of our attentional processing, and thereby introducing new ideas into our creative thinking process. Thank you.